Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear and distinguished guest panelists, former NATO Secretaries-General, Mr. Jaap de Scheffer and Mr. Fogh Rasmussen. Dear Chair and Moderator, Ambassador Baiba Braže, Assistant Secretary-General for Public Diplomacy, dear President of the Atlantic Treaty Association, Mr. Jim Townsend, dear participants in the audience. As your host today, Secretary-General of the Atlantic Treaty Association, I am honored to welcome you to this webinar, which is one of the most important one in the series of webinars that the Atlantic Treaty Association organizes under the name ATA Talks. With today's discussion on the most important alliance in the world, we would like to celebrate NATO's 72nd birthday. As you know, ATA is an organization that promotes Euro-Atlantic values, together with its member organizations from 37 countries in the world. And at this moment, we have many participants coming from our member association. By marking NATO's 72nd anniversary, we contribute to demonstration of NATO's continuous transformation to meet security challenges. And in accordance to NATO 2030 key priorities, we can say it is an alliance that constantly becomes stronger militarily, politically, and more global. Under the topic of this online conference, Reflections and Lessons, Visions for NATO's Future, our distinguished guests will be able to reflect, but more to contemplate on NATO and its future as part of the NATO 2030 effort. Since I'm mentioning reflection, allow me to reflect briefly. Mr. de Scheffer was the 11th Secretary-General, serving from January 2004 till August 2009. And I will just read as an introduction one sentence from the inaugural address. So, quote, "Public diplomacy will be key to our reputation both inside and outside the alliance," ending quote. As we can see, this is a good foundation to contemplate on NATO's future in being stronger politically. Mr. Rasmussen was the 12th Secretary-General, serving from 2009 to 2014. And the quotation I took for this occasion is from one speech during Mr. Rasmussen's visit to the US. And the quote is, "NATO must stand ready," ending quote, which shows how NATO transforms constantly to meet security challenges globally. This will be actually a very interesting discussion. Dear Chair, Ambassador Braže, the floor is yours, and thank you very much.
First of all, good afternoon from Brussels, from NATO headquarters. We hope that the day comes soon that we all can actually welcome you in person to the headquarters. And many thanks to the Atlantic Treaty Association for the series of discussions, ATA Talks, launched by you, Monika, and by our president, ATA President Jim Townsend. And this one, of course, is in support of the Secretary-General's Jens Stoltenberg's initiative to so-called NATO 2030 to prepare the alliance for the future. It's been done during the previous Secretary-General's time, and we are doing it again. NATO is always adapting. So my special greetings today to the two former Secretaries-General for joining us today. It is my privilege and honor to have you today with us, and I wish again that we would have been together in person. When I was preparing for this, it let me sort of think back to 2014, that when together with Lord Robertson, the third Secretary-General whom we wanted to have in today's discussion, you were participating in a panel discussion on NATO in transition. Today, Lord Robertson could not be with us, unfortunately, but he's with us and sends his greetings in his mind and heart, of course. So where are we today? We know that we are having a summit on the 14th of June, that America is back, that the transatlantic bond is being strengthened as we speak. And of course, we are in the midst here at the headquarters and with allies in preparation for the big adaptation of NATO 2030. So please let me briefly just to outline what Secretary-General is meaning with his 2030 vision. And indeed, it has three priorities: to keep Our NATO alliance is the strongest defense alliance, militarily strong, also in the future. To make it politically stronger and to ensure that it takes a more global approach. So first, indeed, we all understand to keep the alliance militarily strong, we need to continue to invest. Both the numbers, the movements, the trends have been good, but we have to continue doing that. It's not just happening by itself. We need the right forces with the right equipment, and we need to keep the technological edge. The emerging disruptive technologies are providing challenges, but they are also providing opportunities. On top of that, to have strong military, we need strong societies. In today's world, with so many threats that are below Article 5, non-kinetic, the resilient societies are the first line of defense. So resilience will be a big theme at the NATO summit this year. When we speak about the political NATO as a political alliance, indeed, the political unity and the strength around it is very much it's the basis of what it is. It is the only place where Europe and America come together every single day, working together, fighting together, exercising together. It is a unique political platform. And the wish indeed is for it to continue to be so, especially in the face of these new challenges and threats globally. And that's why the more global approach is so important. And it was discussed in both your times that the global sort of alliances of values, of democracies, they are the sort of basis on which also NATO will flourish. And our partners globally, our regional organizations, whether that's such as an EU or global partners such as Australia, Japan, Korea, New Zealand, and others, the challenges that we all face together are very similar. From terrorism to nuclear proliferation to weakening of international order, rules-based international order, arms control challenges, and so on and so forth. The rise of China, on top of that, of course, shows that elements of great power competition could exist or could arise even stronger. And neither America nor Europe can deal with such challenges on their own. So, in short, that is why NATO currently, both at the headquarters but also in our military parts and the allied capitals, we had a very wide outreach program and the experts report on 2030. We had youth events and discussions with our youth leaders, think tankers, private sector, to get all of their inputs for this 2030 process. And I think we are in a good place to move ahead. So America and Europe together, adapting for the future and remaining strong, remaining united with a global approach. With this, let me turn to our hosts, back to ATA. And I look forward to a very interesting discussion with our two former Secretary Generals, Jaap Scheffer and Mr. Anders Fogh Rasmussen.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Braže, for this introduction. And we can see that the accent is on this transatlantic, good transatlantic relations and transatlantic cooperation. We have received, as I mentioned in my introduction, lots of our ATA members are present today on this and follow this online conference. We have asked them to send us questions prior to this conference so that more we hear from them, and we would like to know how they feel and what they want to know about reflections of NATO on NATO, but also on NATO's future. And definitely EU-NATO relations or transatlantic cooperation was among lots of a lot of questions as in this or that way. So not to go longer with my some new introduction, I will just proceed with questions because, as I said, we really would like to for our former NATO Secretary-General to hear how ATA is members are looking at NATO and what are they concerned about the most. So first question I will read because as a host coming from the Atlantic Treaty Association, the first question is from Mr. Alex Serban, who is president of ATA Romania, but also vice president of ATA. And his concern is very much specific and related to the role of ATA, because we are now going to this strategic restructuring, or let's say it like that. So the question is, how can NATO best use Atlantic Treaty Association in the current context, and how can ATA best serve the next generation? So the question is for both our guests and, of course, for you, Ambassador Braže.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I have two more questions that have come in also here.
Oh, shall I?
Yes, dear Jaap, could you stop, please? Yeah, thank you.
I'll do that. For me, you are ambassador to the Netherlands, but more than that. The question, the answer to the question, my first answer to that question would be do what we are doing as we speak in trying to reach, I would say, across generations, to not only to explain but to debate why NATO is there, what its value is, and see that public support for NATO, which is still across the board, I think, quite substantial. But why public support for NATO is necessary. And Ambassador Braže mentioned a strong military NATO. With a strong military NATO comes the money and financing your military. And as long as there are still a big number, I'm going to be critical now, of free riders on the European side of the Atlantic, still enjoying the peace dividend, still not doing what they are committed to, the Wales decision on the 2%, Houston, we have a problem. In other words, that is what, in my opinion, and you quoted me from public diplomacy, what the ATA should do. And then I say, try to reach across generations and try to reach across national boundaries. Final remark. I think that when you mentioned NATO 2030, in combination with the fact that we now have a second superpower, which is of course completely new, that was not yet the case in my time. I think in Anders's time it was changing. We have a world in which we have two superpowers. And then you have a debate on politics, on trade, on tech, not to forget, on data, on AI, on cyber, and what have you. But let's not forget that, in my opinion, that debate, that quote unquote battle, is also very much an ideological battle. And NATO is an alliance of values and should be an alliance of values. So let's not forget the ideological component. We are dealing with a society in China, with a civilization which is ancient, which is respected, but when it comes to values, with a completely different mindset. So that is what I think, in short, ATA should do. Make an important contribution, not only to the quote-unquote traditional NATO topics and traditional NATO subjects, but also specifying why NATO is an alliance of values and what it should do, and what that means, of course, for the political positioning vis-a-vis a superpower like China, together with the Americans, and together with, and Ambassador Braže, you mentioned that quite rightly, and I know that Anders has a lot of experience in this regard as well, together with other democracies. Not for nothing, Joe Biden has started with his alliance of democracies, and that's my final word for the moment. Otherwise, I'll become too long. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I fully agree with Jaap on all what he said. I would like to highlight two issues, two matters that are of concern to me. Firstly, I think ATA should focus on the young generation, really much, because none of us here in this panel have experienced the Second World War, but at least we lived through the Cold War. We understand why we do have NATO. But the young generation takes freedom and democracy for granted, and security and peace for granted. I think it's important to teach the new generation, the young generation, why it is important to stand together in a successful and strong military defense alliance. So that's one thing. Secondly, it's also a matter of concern to see that opinion polls indicate that in some NATO member states, there is a majority that think that their respective countries should not come to the aid of an ally that were to be attacked. And no reason to hide that I'm concerned about opinion polls in Germany and France, indicating that a majority in those two countries do not want their country to engage in case a fellow NATO member state were to be attacked. I think that's a matter of concern, and that's a lack of solidarity. So I think ATA should also focus on that solidarity aspect, because the fact is that the famous Article 5, where we have pledged to help each other in case one ally is attacked, that is the core of NATO, and that is the reason why no one has even dared to think about attacking a NATO ally since the establishment of NATO 72 years ago. So I would focus on those two issues.
Thank you very much for the question. What ATA should do? We regularly meet, of course, with ATA's board, so we have developed the thinking together. And just as both Jaap and Anders said, priority audiences for all of us are young audiences. Since both of your times at NATO, what NATO has done is developed an extensive audience research program. And we do the annual and the quarterly audience research to understand what our audiences, what our publics think, what is important. And indeed, you are right, completely right, and data shows it, that the young people know the least about NATO, and their knowledge is less, and also their support is less than compared with other age groups. So they are our primary audience for our activities, be it on communications or public diplomacy and outreach side. And that when I think about ATA, indeed, ATA is the organization, is the collection of people that are passionate about what NATO is. And what NATO is a security and defense of 1 billion people. And those, of course, the fact that NATO exists together with other institutions has guaranteed peace and security for these 72 years in our countries. And it has meant that generations and generations of children can go to school, they can get education, they can grow up without thinking that one day they will lose or might lose it all. So de facto, it's sort of NATO is a victim of its own success, let's put it that way. When we look at the audience polling, of course, the other group that is of particular interest are women, because they do perceive security differently. And for them, different notions mean different things. There is a difference in perceptions. So that is another particular group where we devote quite a lot of outreach activities, and where I think ATA in their countries could also be pitching in. The third aspect for ATA, again, is a lobby, is a sort of motivation for be it with regard to politicians or journalists or wider public events. But overall, currently under Jim Townsend's leadership and Monika's able management, ATA has really been reborn, and we are very, very pleased about it. So we work closely and we work well. I have two questions to each of the former Secretary Generals. Dear Jaap, you did mention China, and you did mention the sort of more global aspect to the challenges that we are faced. Should we see China as a strategic competitor? Should we somehow try to identify more particular type of actions that we should take? Is there a need for new security architecture in terms of building it with our global partners? And that could contribute to NATO becoming more global. How should we answer these challenges?
Well, let me start my answer by your reflection, Baiba, on the opinion polls. I think the situation as we have seen it since the Second World War, the United States of America in full solidarity with Canada and its partners on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean is historically very special. And as Anders was rightly saying, we have grown up, I have grown up as a classical transatlanticist. So I've become a European as well, but as a classical transatlanticist. What is new, and it is why I mentioned China as a superpower in my first answer, what is new, I think, is that when you look at the Biden agenda, apart from his Herculean internal political agenda, which is really gargantuan, to use another expression, we must realize on the European side of the Atlantic Ocean that the Atlantic relationship cannot be the first priority of the Biden administration. The first priority of the Biden administration is China as a superpower and entirely new. And I do not like anymore the expression rising China. China has risen. If you look at the ambitions of Xi Jinping in China 2025, 2049, 100 years of the revolution, China is a superpower. And because China is a superpower, the US administration must, and Obama qualified himself already, I'll help you remember, as a Pacific president. I am a Pacific president, Obama said. Not that they neglect the transatlantic relationship, but we in Europe, we should realize this. And together with the Americans, and in NATO more specifically, because the Americans are at the table, I think we should, and in my opinion, along the lines of the very valuable Reflection Group report, where they pay a lot of attention to China, see that also NATO maps out all the security challenges facing us, facing the alliance, where it concerns China. And then I'm less interested in defining what China is. We should be careful with sloganism. I mean, I see it at the other side of Brussels from time to time. A geopolitical commission. What does it mean? China as a systemic rival. What does it mean? As long as you do not bring content to those slogans, they are fairly empty. But it is crystal clear to me, and I mentioned the topics, many topics concerning NATO in that broad security dimension of our relationship with China. First of all, you need an outreach to Asia as NATO. And I repeat what I said about the alliance of democracies. We have good experiences with all of them, be it Australia, be it New Zealand, be it South Korea, be it Japan in the Afghanistan coalition. Another topic, which of course colored my mandate between 2004 and 2009. And see that we do not, on this side of the Atlantic Ocean, consider China a responsibility of the United States of America. We can't do that, of course, because of trade and politics and all the other matters, but there is a very specific security dimension which NATO has to handle. Look at the ambitions China has, and I can't blame Xi Jinping or I can't blame the Chinese of having the ambition to be a superpower. That is also a reality in the present day world, in my opinion. So follow the reflection group recommendations on China in a broad political perspective. Don't waste your time, systemic rival, antagonist, enemy. I'm not so much interested in those qualifications, but realize what China's ambitions are and realize, I repeat what I said before, that we're dealing with a society and a civilization which is completely different from ours. Think about human rights, think about the Uyghurs, think about strangling democracy in Hong Kong. Think about the 2 Canadians held. Think about bullying Australia. I mean, that is a completely different ballgame. And that's politically relevant for us, but in its domain, it's politically very relevant for NATO.
Thank you very much. Indeed, the sort of global partnership also is expected to be one of the bigger outcomes of the summit. The modalities we are still discussing, but there is a consensus among allies and among the thinkers and also the private sectors that we need global partnerships. We need this together we are stronger approach. And as for China, indeed, it's a challenge, but it's also enormous opportunities. And if we are serious about climate change, we need China to buy in. That's a winner for everyone. So we saw that also from the White House organized global climate summit last week. So indeed, that's a pretty challenging one in terms of trying to frame it. So your advice is not to try to frame it, but just deal on the positive side with engaging on partnerships and doing what we need to do. Dear Anders, your term was also pretty challenging as a Secretary-General. Was it Afghanistan? Was it Russian activities, destabilizing actions? Was it Libya? And so on and so forth. So more challenges that we can enumerate, actually. And it was during your time, indeed, that after Russian invasion in Georgia, the new strategic concept of the time was starting to be prepared, and in 2010 it was accepted. And you stated at the time that it should have the spirit of Washington Treaty, that it should be understood by Oklahoma milkmen. Now we, of course, are discussing whether we need to whether leaders need to task to update that strategic concept from 2010, and I would very much welcome your thoughts on that.
Yes, we need to update it because we, in the current strategic concept, we are stating that it's our ambition to develop what we call a strategic partnership between NATO and Russia. Unfortunately, we have to conclude we didn't reach that. We did a lot, even as you mentioned, after the Russian attack on Georgia. We tried to reset our relations with Russia. I still remember that at my very first press conference as new Secretary-General in August 2009, so 1 year after the Russian invasion of Georgia, I reached out to Russia. I said, we will make it a priority to improve our relationship with Russia. We want cooperation with Russia. We want a strategic partnership. And we succeeded in developing certain practical cooperation areas. But in 2014, February, March 2014, we realized that our ambitions were not shared by Russia. Russia invaded Ukraine, annexed Crimea, illegally into the Russian Federation and started a destabilization operation in eastern Ukraine. So we are in a completely new security situation, and that reason alone makes it necessary to update the strategic concept. Now, when it comes to our Russian relationship, I think the Europeans have to come to terms with our relationship with Russia. One of the weaknesses in Europe is our divisions when it comes to our approach to Russia. There are certain countries that want to accommodate Russia. There are other countries that are much more skeptical, even hostile when it comes to Russia. But we really have to unify when it comes to the European approach to Russia. I would like to mention certain elements. Firstly, we need to reaffirm our open door policy. And in that respect, we should state that the decision we took at the Bucharest summit in 2008 still stands. That is, Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. Once, of course, they have to fulfill the necessary criteria, but there is nothing to stop them from becoming one day part of the alliance. And it's for the alliance and the respective applicant countries to make that decision. It's not for the Kremlin. So that's the first thing. We should reaffirm our open door policy. Secondly, we should further strengthen our territorial defense, not least in the East. We have already enhanced our forward presence in the Baltics and in Poland. However, we have only what I would call a tailored forward presence in the Black Sea. And this is simply no longer fit for purpose. Russia can now stop civilian traffic in parts of the Black Sea for periods up to 6 months at a time. We need to work with allies in the Black Sea to boost their own capabilities and enhance their naval and air assets. And my third point is that while diplomatic efforts are always important and we should do our utmost to ensure a constructive dialogue with Russia, it's not enough. Words alone are not enough. And I think we could send an important signal that we can also walk the talk. For example, we could really show our support for Ukraine by setting up, I would call it a battalion-sized unit, training with Ukrainian soldiers in a Ukrainian training facility on Ukrainian soil. That would not be in contradiction with the current framework of the cooperation between Ukraine and NATO. On the contrary, and it would send an important signal to Russia. Seen retrospectively, I think that we did our utmost to reach a good conclusion in Bucharest in 2008. I think Jaap will agree on that. But I think at the end of the day, we sent the wrong signal to Putin of division, weakness within NATO, because Georgia and Ukraine requested a membership action plan. We could not agree on that. Instead, we agreed on some actually more strong language that they will become members of NATO. But Putin left the NATO-Russia summit in Bucharest believing that NATO would not react if he attacked Georgia. So he wanted to send a clear message, and that he did that in August 2008. We should not repeat that mistake. Putin respects strong language. So let's keep united and keep a firm stance towards Russia.
Thank you very much. But if I may still prompt you a little bit on the strategic concept, what would you include in the updated one?
Yeah, I have already mentioned or outlined what I think should be really a priority in the new strategic concept, namely strengthen territorial defense. That remains the core purpose of NATO. Secondly, I fully agree with Jaap. NATO should also focus on the Indo-Pacific region. Let's recall that while NATO, of course, is a transatlantic defense organization, one of our allies, at least, is also a Pacific nation. And the question, of course, arises, if someone were to attack the United States, could that initiate an invocation of Article 5? Personally, I think yes. But to prevent that, I think we should send a very clear signal to China. For instance, on Taiwan, we know that the United States has pledged to actually defend Taiwan in case Taiwan were to be attacked by mainland China. I think NATO should elaborate a strategic concept that opens the possibility that in that case, other NATO allies would help the United States. That would send a very strong signal to China, not to seek confrontation, but actually to prevent a war between mainland China and Taiwan. Thirdly, I would mention, of course, the new threats coming from hybrid warfare, new technology, including artificial intelligence, and the way that will change future warfare. For instance, we can imagine swarms of unmanned drones that could attack an enemy. So we have to address that. We have to regulate that area, just to mention three important issues in a new strategic concept.
Excellent. Those three, I'm sure that will be part of the outcome of the summit, and also will be included in thinking when allies start updating the next strategic concept. And also probably the climate change and the climate security will be there. I think you will both agree on that. The emerging and disruptive technologies and how NATO maintains its technological edge. You know, there will be the whole set of points that I think we all can agree. Jaap, you did mention 2% defense spending and how nations perceive it, whether we all spend for the capabilities that are needed and what we spend. And we have a question from ATA Belgium about it, that in view of the difficult post-COVID recovery, the climate change priorities and huge budgetary constraints, this all implies that 2% goal for the defense budgets might not be significant anymore. Should we discuss other incentives to develop new military capabilities related to cyber, AI, or other new threats and opportunities? I just would like to add that actually our audience research and the polls shows that there is incredibly strong support for the transatlantic bond. It's almost 80% among our citizens that support that, but there's also large support for defense spending, for maintaining or even increasing defense spending, close to 60% of NATO citizens. What do you think? Should we be creative around that?
Well, I would not advise creativity along the 2% Wales commitment, because I know, having been a politician for a long time, like Anders, that if you start being creative, you might lose your ultimate target. And you mentioned polls, but our governments are not acting accordingly. May I take my own nation, rich nation? I think the 18th or 19th economy on the globe. We are doing extremely poorly, not even being able to reach the NATO average, which is about 1.43 or whatever percent of GDP. So I'm concerned that if we leave the 2% target under the heading, we have a lot of other priorities. We might lose it altogether. Look, I disagreed on almost everything where it concerned foreign and defense policy with the former US president. But President Biden will not be different. He'll mention it in a more civilized way in asking us Europeans, and I mentioned the European Union before, dear friends on the other side of the ocean, we are back. The United States are back. I'm a very strong supporter of the multilateral rules-based international order. I'm a strong supporter of NATO. But dear friends in Europe, what is your weight in our partnership? What is your weight in our partnership? That's a key political question, which should be on the table, in my opinion. I use the word free riders. I think that, again, that's the easiest. Taking my own country, the Netherlands, as an example, we are and have been a free rider for decades now, and that cannot last. In other words, and then you come back to Anders's remarks on the ATA question on the younger generation. It is very complicated. We must do it, but very complicated indeed, to sell, quote unquote, the idea that we have to spend on defense, where Dutch naval ships cannot sail anymore because of a lack of equipment. The same is the case in Germany. There are some good examples, of course, as well. So I think that's at least what I'm doing, but I'm a usual suspect. We are usual suspects as we're sitting in this webinar. Convince that young generation that freedom and democracy do not come for nothing. So I'll go on to make that point, and I repeat, President Biden, in a different language, will come to Brussels at the NATO summit with this question: what is your weight in this partnership? And that reflects on what Anders was saying about Russia. Please, let's have a consistent Russia policy. Anders mentioned the European Union, but also in NATO, there is, of course, as we all know, there is no consensus. Not only not on China, but no consensus on Russia. I presided over the Battle of Bucharest, as I call it. That was a real battle. I do not see on Ukraine and Georgia consensus on the horizon at the moment, because I don't see Berlin and Paris making a step forward. I agree with Anders. We should not walk away from communique, but it was indeed an end result in Bucharest in confusion. And Putin read that confusion rightly. And there might be a direct line from Bucharest 2008 to Crimea 2014. So, I mean, in other words, coming back to the question, if we don't do our share as European NATO allies, then the situation will not last. And the same is relevant, and then I'll stop. It has not been mentioned yet, for the great importance I attach, and Secretary-General Stoltenberg mentioned it in his press conference after the foreign ministers meeting last week. We should work on the NATO-EU relationship, and the European Union should not strive for strategic autonomy. I don't like that word autonomy, neither do the Americans, as I hear. Strategic power is fine. But the European Union should, of course, as a complement to NATO, be in a position at a certain stage to project its own power in scenarios, of course, under Article 5, where not directly NATO will be involved. I give you one example, the Sahelian zone. There's a lot going on in the Sahel, which is Europe's southern border, in my opinion, not the Mediterranean, but the Sahelian zone. We've seen the Chadian president die in battle climate change meets terrorism meets migration. It's a very toxic mix in that region. Now imagine, which is not too far-fetched in my opinion, that at a certain stage there might be the need to project military power in the Sahel. Could we then go to the Oval Office, ring the doorbell and say, dear President Biden, could you please help us out? I think then the Europeans, European Union plus non-EU member partners should be able to do that. In other words, that should also be a signal of taking responsibility and not always immediately run to the Americans. Of course, in many scenarios, that's what NATO is for. Anders mentioned that. But also the NATO-European Union relationship is of key importance here. Supported by the Americans, as long as you do not, and I come back to my mentioning of sloganism, what is strategic autonomy? What is it? What is autonomy in the military domain in the European Union after Brexit? That's only France, basically, and Germany, hopefully politically. In other words, this is what we should do, and this is where we Europeans should take our responsibility in the financial domain, but also very much in the political domain. And in that regard, I'm an Atlanticist, but certainly also a European. And we were just mentioning Anders as Danish president, who also showed himself a devoted European. But the European Union should cease to be the financial economic giant, the political adolescent, and the military midget. And that's still the case, I'm afraid. And that's not in the interest of NATO.
Very interesting, fascinating to be discussing this with both of you. No need to say that I fully agree about the imaginary 2% or even further increases of defense spending if they are spent wisely and invested in the right capabilities. And when we think about that, of course, during the pandemic, we saw that our militaries were the institution actually that was able really to make the difference in quite a number of countries, whether that's internally providing the hospitals, logistics support, planning support, all types of things to the civilian sector, to the medical sector, but also among allies, really ensuring that one ally was helping the other. There was that feeling of solidarity, and I think our public saw in reality what it means to have a well-prepared, effective, properly equipped defense sector. They could see that it makes a difference also in times of crisis within our countries. So in that respect, we did ad hoc polling last year, and we saw that NATO, lots of the help that was received by different countries within the alliance, but also externally. We even sent support with UK defence forces to Ghana, and the World Food Programme, that it was branded "We are NATO," and our audiences noticed that. There was a recognition of NATO providing that relief, pandemic relief. And that, of course, in a way also brings me to the next question. You both were very active, both in the so-called public diplomacy, but also in communications and reaching out to the publics. Jaap even chose NATO horse together with his wife Janine, that was later placed in one of Brussels parks. And of course, as it was quoted, you paid a particular attention also in your first speech, but also in your work to the outreach of our publics. You, Anders, you were the first to start a Twitter channel and your blog and very active social media work. Again, innovative new approaches through your work. When we look at the phenomenon of disinformation, and we have a question about it from ATA UK, that external actors are really capitalizing internally in our countries and spreading disinformation, which is dividing our societies, which is limiting the efforts of our governments, be it on vaccines or be it on electoral processes or other processes around the vital functions of our democratic societies. How do you think in the current world with private sector playing such an important role, social media platforms and others, in spreading the news, in amplifying various stories, what are the right ways and methods to counter disinformation, and how to make NATO's story heard?
Yeah, if I may start with the latter, how to make NATO heard. Of course, NATO should modernize its communication. And I would say a lot has been done during recent years. But I still remember that it was quite controversial that I used social media very actively and also try to communicate very actively because NATO used to be a more secretive, more closed, communication-wise, more closed organization. I understand very well why. That was maybe also based on history during the Cold War. A defense organization, of course, can't reveal everything. But we are living in a new era. So we need to be more open. We need to be more outspoken. So, in my opinion, NATO should do much more on the communication front. I still remember that Jaap actually prepared NATO television. I still remember that I pushed a button in 2008 in Bucharest to inaugurate it. And based on that, we have gradually modernized NATO communication. But in my opinion, NATO should devote more resources to public diplomacy, actually. Public diplomacy, I think you're doing a great job already, but it could absolutely be expanded. So that's one thing.
I, of course, fully agree with you, Anders.
Yeah, I'm not surprised, but really comes from my heart. I think communication, our communication is the most efficient means to counter disinformation. But of course, that's only one thing. Secondly, we should also monitor the whole communication era. Actually, within my foundation, I established in 2017, Alliance of Democracies Foundation. Within that foundation, we are running what we call a transatlantic commission on election integrity. Actually, it's a body I co-founded with President Biden in 2018. And we are monitoring foreign meddling into our democratic processes, of course, election campaigns, but also on a daily basis, they're meddling into our democratic processes, including disinformation. And I think to raise awareness of disinformation, that's one other very important measure to make our people much more resilient when it comes to disinformation. So more open, outspoken communication from our side, combined with monitoring the disinformation campaigns from other sides, including developing tools to detect such disinformation. And actually, you can do that. You can develop tools to detect so-called fake news, bots that amplify disinformation, etc. So I would recommend those two tools.
Jaap, what do you think? Should we let the private companies decide what is free speech and how far should it go or not? Does NATO have any concern about it, or should NATO bother at all?
No, NATO should definitely bother, and I can only echo Anders in the tools NATO has. But like in the European Union, I could imagine that on these issues, and you asked rightly asked the question, should the private sector decide? NATO and the private sector, NATO and its relationship with the private sector is an interesting topic, I think, which at least during my mandate was not a topic being discussed. But let me give you an example. In my own country, the Netherlands, there's a huge gap between public and private sector. People search their careers either in the public or in the private sector. Once public, all the time public, once private, all the time private. So they grow apart. They grow apart not only professionally, but also mentally. Now, I could very well imagine that in answering your question, and the reflection group also consisted of members with experience in the private sector. And Anders, you will remember that the 2010 strategic concept came about under the leadership of Madeleine Albright, of course, and Jeroen van der Veer, the former CEO of Shell, where in the beginning everybody said, also to me, you're an idiot. Why are you getting someone from the private sector in? My answer was always, because that guy will ask questions I will not ask anymore, because I'm molded and formed in a long career, and I ask the well-known questions, and I want to have people who ask the not so well-known questions, if you see what I mean. Coming back to your question, I could very well imagine that in this world of quantum computing, of AI, of cyber, of biotechnology, you name it, not only in the European Union, there is every single reason, more reason perhaps than in NATO, to have a forum where you can discuss these issues and discuss these matters. We can learn a lot from the private sector, is my experience, which I have experienced after my NATO years. And I'm quite convinced that the private sector can also learn a lot from us. And in the openness Anders is quite rightly advocating, I think a platform where you would have private and public sector, NATO and the private sector together on these kind of issues might be very helpful, also in the run-up to a new strategic concept.
Very, very interesting. Yes, indeed. As part of, after Secretary-General launched the 2030 initiative in June, there was a very wide public outreach, and private sector was a particular audience that we tried to reach. And as you rightly say, NATO largely depends on the success of private sector. When we think about military capabilities, those are mostly private sector developed capabilities. When we look at the AGS, for example, or AVAX, or any other modern capabilities, that is all this result of the success of the private sector. But then again, the new phenomenon with regard to the information sphere, with regard to social media platforms, with regard to what is happening to our traditional media, to the qualitative journalism where, you need two sources, you need cross-checking, you need investigative journalism. It's not just about opinions, it's actually about the facts. That is, I think, where the challenge lies for all of us, because, again, NATO is not a place to regulate. NATO is a place to consult and discuss and cooperate on these issues. So the regulation either then comes nationally or in the bodies that have the proper remit. So NATO will, of course, take and work with it. And again, when we think about it, private sector is inherently interested of being on board with this, not undermining our democratic processes and institutions, because they have benefited from it. All these companies, they are, of course, our companies, allied companies from democratic countries, and they have benefited from it. So there is a task for the governments also to reach out and to explain what we are talking about and where are the concerns. We have established a sort of a channel for dialogue in that respect through the outreach process of 2030, and there were really responses from the private sector companies. It's the first time that they heard these communication and social media platforms that NATO was interested to talk to them, and that was very, very interesting process in that respect. So overall, I think we are moving ahead also in that respect. But as Anders said, it will largely depend how resilient our societies are. And there are so many elements. One is indeed NATO needs to tell its story first, so we need to continue invest in the transformation in the communications. That's our task, that's what we are doing to make sure that our story is heard by our publics, by partners, but also by potential or existing adversaries. They need to know that NATO is united, strong, and committed, right? We of course need to work at the grassroots level. We need the NGOs, the academics, we need media, we need quality sources out there in every country who is able to tell the facts, who is able to really show that truth exists. Not everything is just imaginative or questionable. That facts exist and truth and values actually exist. Don't you agree?
Yes, if I may add to this, NATO is not always the first responder or should be the first responder. I think when it comes to countering disinformation, a close relationship between NATO and the European Union is warranted. And I would very much like the NATO-EU partnership to be an important element of the new strategic concept. To be very concrete, I think you should consider establishing a special EU-NATO partnership council, a forum where NATO and the EU can discuss issues on a continuous basis at all levels. We do know it's difficult because of the well-known dispute between Turkey and Cyprus. That's been an obstacle all the way through because Cyprus doesn't have a security agreement with NATO. That's why Turkey is blocking Cypriot participation in formal meetings between NATO and the EU. And of course, the EU will not accept to meet without all member states present. That's understandable. But on the other hand, Cyprus is also blocking Turkey's observer status in European Defence Agency. For instance, Norway, also a non-EU NATO member, has such an observer status, but Cyprus has blocked that Turkey can get that. I think the key to unlock this very unfortunate situation would be to trade the two issues, to offer to Turkey observer status in EDA, and in exchange, Turkey should accept a security agreement between Cyprus and NATO. And based on that, we could move forward and increase the number of formal meetings between the EU and NATO. One possibility would be to establish an EU-NATO partnership council, like NATO has partnership forums with other partners. And I think we should have more summits between EU and NATO and ministerials. Why not? I mean, EU should be and is actually the closest partner when it comes to partnerships. But it's also, there is a suspicion in Brussels between the EU headquarters and NATO headquarters. That's a fact. We should try our utmost to overcome that. And I think a dialogue with the European Union in the run-up to the adoption of the new NATO strategic concept would be beneficial.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Certainly in countering disinformation and in working with our colleagues at the EU, that is true. We have a genuine partnership and a very close everyday relationship. For the wider political decisions, the summit will discuss what is the most appropriate way ahead. But speaking whether it's military mobility or resilience or cyber or hybrids or any other, EDTs and so on and so forth, it's obviously we need this partnership. very much so. Changing our discussion. Sorry, Jaap? Yes.
No, the
Yes,
advantage former SecGens like Anders and I have is that we can go, and I think I agree, we should go one step further. I once qualified in my mandate when the situation was very bad. I once called it, I was castigated and criticized for it, a frozen conflict. A frozen conflict in Brussels between NATO and the European Union, and I couldn't agree more with Anders that we should absolutely and definitely try to solve this fundamental gap we have in Brussels between Evere and the Berlaymont and the Council building in Brussels. So I would bring it with Anders. I would bring it one level up than just within let's say the NATO military domain. It is political military and as I said, and I repeat, I'm a very faithful and devoted Atlanticist. But you can be an Atlanticist by also being a devoted and strong European. At least that's what I'm trying to do.
And I agree. Of course, I think everybody would agree, and possibly step by step we get there. There were talks that were starting this week. It's a process. We know there are things that can be solved. I think we all are hopeful that gradually the issues will be solved. Which brings me to a different set of questions, which comes from ATA Romania, and it's around some of our closest partners in Middle East and Northern Africa region, where indeed NATO has formed pretty close relationship, also thanks to efforts of both of you. And we've been supporting our partners there through political initiatives, through training, through presence. And that region, we all know, is crucial for us, for it to have stability, for it to have a sort of predictability, prosperity, and not only for NATO, but also for the EU. It's crucial that is all there. But when we think about the sort of strategic approaches to the region, the question is, should NATO stay away from the Middle East? Or should NATO do more with the countries in the region? And what should be this type of strategic approach?
We should do more. I mean, Europe has for some time now been paying the price for the lack of engagement. I still remember we had a discussion at a certain stage during my mandate as Secretary General of NATO whether NATO should engage in Syria, for instance. It was about, in concrete terms, it was about creating a safe zone where refugees could have a safe place instead of fleeing across Turkey and eventually end up in Europe. But there was no consensus within NATO, no consensus. So we had to stay away. And that's an example that not to act is actually also an action that has consequences. And at the end of the day, it may be more costly, both in life and treasures, than to actually engage. So I'm very much in favor of engagement in the Middle East. When speaking about that, many people doubt that it was a wise decision to engage by NATO in Libya. But what we did was to execute a decision taken by the United Nations. We implemented a mandate, and when the mandate expired by the end of October 2011, we left. I expected the international community, that is the United Nations, to step in, take over, help the new authorities to build a new society, but nothing happened. The international community failed. This is the reason why today Libya is a failed state. It's not because of the NATO action. The NATO military operation was an unprecedented success. Absolutely. So in our near neighborhood, we as Europeans do have a clear interest in the NATO engagement. That would also require more of the essential capabilities. For instance, in Europe, we have more soldiers than America, but we can't move them anywhere because we don't have the airlift. So we have to invest in airlift. We have to invest in drones, in surveillance, intelligence, etc. All those advanced capabilities, air-to-air refueling, just to mention something. We have to focus on those capabilities that have been identified in the NATO defense planning process as needed capabilities to engage much more in the near neighborhood than we have done previously. Because at the end of the day, that is also territorial defense.
Jaap, what do you think? You traveled a lot to the region.
I did, and I do. Anders is right. I'll mention the Mediterranean Dialogue and the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative, where we should continue to pay attention. I said in response to an earlier question already that I think, speaking as a European now, our southern border is in the Sahel and not in the Mediterranean. So that also means political outreach, but also the elements Anders mentioned a moment ago. Libya is a case in point where, unfortunately, in my opinion, given the fact that the international community did not react after the successful NATO action, also, in fact, the responsibility to protect doctrine was brought to its grave, which from a values and human rights point of view was, I think, a very useful addition. And that's, as we all remember, how it all started. If I'm correct, Nicolas Sarkozy and David Cameron initiating political support. Well, we all know what happened afterwards, including the NATO operation during Anders Fogh Rasmussen's mandate. So I think we should definitely reach out. And in the region, there is also ambition for NATO and for NATO reaching out. And that goes for the Gulf monarchies as much as it goes for the countries around the Mediterranean. So my very first summit as SecGen of NATO in 2004 was the Istanbul summit, where the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative was launched. And I think it is as important now as it was then to continue this outreach. And I must conclude that in the later years of my mandate, there was a certain loss of ambition with the allies. But I hope we can keep that up. It's all part of what you said, Baiba, in your introduction of the word global, a global NATO, not a NATO which is the firemen and policemen of the world, definitely not, but a NATO knowing how to reach out globally. And that includes the Asia Pacific, what we discussed in answering an earlier question, but very much also the backyard in Europe, I say. And it has not been mentioned yet. Let's not forget the Balkans in that regard. Let's not forget the Balkans. And let's not forget a nation like Bosnia-Herzegovina, which in my opinion is not yet completely stable. Let's realize that Serbia is still sitting on the fence. Lots of Russian influence there, of course. Lots of Chinese influence, by the way, as well. Traveling through the Balkans, I see Russian influence, I see Chinese influence, I see even Saudi influence. In other words, let us not forget as NATO the Western Balkans, so that the demons of the past will not re-emerge. And let's be constructive in that regard politically. That also, by the way, goes, and there you see how important this relationship between NATO and the European Union is. That also is highly relevant for the European Union in their outreach and their to my great regret, a very difficult situation in reaching out to the Balkans and not being able to give some countries even an EU perspective, be it in 15, 20, 25 years. I'm not saying that is around the corner. So yes, continue the outreach in the Middle East, but don't forget the Balkans.
Absolutely. That's a reinvigoration of NATO's efforts, actually, both in strengthening the institutions in the MENA region, whether we need, more support on defense capacity building, the stronger institution building, training. There are a variety of issues that we are currently discussing. Certainly, there is when we look at the three core tasks of NATO of collective defense, of crisis management, and the cooperative security, there's a lot of attention on all three, actually, and we do expect that the summit and the outcomes of the summit will concentrate also on the cooperative security with particular results. And the Balkans, indeed, also for my division, for public diplomacy, it's one of the priority divisions. We do a lot, and we have strengthened also contact point embassies network to make sure that the allies on the ground actually work together. Kosovo leader Kurti was today meeting Secretary-General here at NATO. And we know the roles that KFOR plays there, and how important it is for the stability of the whole region. Yes, indeed, I can only agree that Western Balkans are important to all of us. And now, of course, with new allies, with North Macedonia celebrating its year in NATO, with Montenegro, more than 3 years, we can say that, yes, NATO is also part of Western Balkan solutions, not only that Western Balkans are on NATO's agenda, per se. No. We will be slowly wrapping up, but I would like, in my last point to you, refer to a question that came from the UK, which has to do, in a way, with what we started, with the Alliance of Democracies. So there will be a NATO summit before there is a G7 meeting in the format of D10 or 10 democracies, also with Australia, India, and South Korea. EU is reaching out a lot also to the like-minded states around the world. So we all are sort of trying to form these various alliances, more institutional or not, around the like-mindedness and values. When we think about that in the future, and when we think about the variety and myriad of these different coalitions and organizations, should we just, as Jaap said at the beginning, try to formulate what we are for and stick to it instead of looking at the potential adversaries and thinking how we can promote who we are and what we stand for? It's an obvious question, but it has a deep meaning. Because it's not just words, huh? Jaap, Anders, please.
Yeah, I fully agree with Jaap on that. It's important to tell the public what we are for. In the current strategic concept, we have outlined 3 core tasks for NATO: territorial defense, crisis management, cooperative security. I think those 3 tasks should remain in the new strategic concept, but adapted to the situation as of today. More territorial defense in the East, as I said, including in the Indo-Pacific. Crisis management, we should really be better equipped to engage in the near neighborhood in the Middle East, for instance, as we discussed. And cooperative security, I would put much more focus on the partnership between the European Union and NATO. And I think that's a positive message. If I may, I would add that in general, I think NATO allies should devote more resources to NATO as such. During my mandate, we had a continuous problem to finance essential activities. And it is a fact that in a joint effort, you can achieve much more than on a national basis. Not only when it comes to acquisitions of expensive military equipment, we've invented the concept smart defense, you call it what you wish, but it's much more efficient to procure expensive military equipment jointly instead of on a national basis. So higher budgets and more common action within NATO would be warranted. And then finally, as a former Secretary General of NATO, I would argue strongly for giving the Secretary General of NATO a stronger executive power than today. Of course, we shouldn't abolish the principle of unanimity within NATO. We should keep that, okay. But we have to speed up the decision-making processes. And I was very often frustrated by the slow decision-making process that even in subordinate committees, nations are able to block decisions by preventing consensus. I think the Secretary General should have the power to bring those discussions to the Council, to the NAC, if they get stalled at the subordinate level. So let's keep the principle of unanimity, but give the Secretary General more power to actually move forward when it's necessary, because that's also part of being more fit for fight in today's world, that you need a more speedy decision-making process. You cannot maintain the decision-making processes that were introduced when NATO was invented 72 years ago. You have to adapt to today's world. So I would strongly argue in favor of stronger executive powers to the Secretary General of NATO.
I do very much agree with Anders, certainly on the last point he was making, but also on the others. For me, the essential roof over the NATO 2030 building would be to see that NATO grows up politically, and that NATO allies realize that NATO is a political military organization in that order. I think a military organization only would never survive in an era where there is more politics needed than ever before in NATO's history. A globalized world with two superpowers instead of one. Let me warn, by the way, nobody mentioned it, of course, and nobody asked it, but let's be careful. And you mentioned opinion polls, Baiba. There can never be any talk of equidistance between Europe and the US on the one hand and China on the other hand. That's also a result of a recent ECFR, European Council on Foreign Relations poll, which worried me greatly. Because there is this ambition for equidistance, because there's, after all, a lot of neutrality in the European DNA. Let's not forget that. There's a lot of neutrality in DNA. So we should avoid a position where we have to choose between the Americans and the Chinese. Come on. That is a message which NATO should voice very, very clearly. The uniqueness in history, what I said before, that you have a superpower, United States of America, so fully involved in NATO and fully involved in protecting its allies, and the other way around. But then becoming political, and you have to be political, as Anders and I have both been saying, to have a consistent Russia policy, and to have a consistent China policy, and not being haunted by a lack of consensus on many issues regarding Russia and many issues regarding China. So become more political, and I'll end with my experience as a young second secretary in the Dutch NATO delegation between 1978 and 1980. Every week, the NAC, and I was sitting in the back, if I was allowed in at all. Every NAC meeting had as a standard on the agenda statements on political topics, on political subjects. And in those days, the whole world was discussed. And during my mandate, at a certain stage, I asked the nations, the allies, might it be a good idea that I or the Deputy Secretary-General or whoever takes up contact with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where the Chinese and the Russians are cooperating? The answer was, no way, no way. Come on. What is the SCO? So what is the SCO? That is anyway, just to underline that NATO is a political military organization and should fully discuss the questions we are all faced with globally. Be they military? Yes, of course. Be they political? Yes, of course. Let me end on this note, Baiba.
It was a very inspiring and sort of also reaffirming discussion for me, and I think for all our colleagues who are watching, to take these inputs from you and feed them into Secretary General's priorities. It's been great, and it's great to hear that you literally endorse what we are doing at the HQ. Thank you very much. En Jaap, jij hebt groetjes van Chaco. I look forward welcoming you all to the NATO HQ, and I give back the floor to our dear friend, Jim Townsend, Atlantic Treaty Association's president. Jim, thank you for putting this together.
Ambassador, thank you so much for just a brilliant morning for me here in Washington. It's a great way to start my day. I just am so thrilled with this discussion, and I think we should do this once a year, if not twice a year. This is just the wisdom that has come across. The information that I know NATO headquarters and all of us need to hear has just been stellar. And to this Secretaries General, thank you so much for the time you've given us. You are very busy, but the wisdom you hold is so important to us. And we have seen that manifest today. And I think in terms of the ATA and Monika, and I would say also NATO PDD and the Assistant Secretary General, who is doing a fabulous job with this outreach. I just want to, on behalf of all of us, I want to thank you so much for the time, and I hope we can come knocking on your door again. Thank you so much, and I look forward to other such ATA talks in the future.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I say see you soon.
Bye-bye, groeten aan Chaco, ook van Janine. Hè?
Oké, fantastisch. Dankjewel. Bye, Anders.
Bye, Anders. Thank you.
Tot de
Nice
volgende.
to meet you all again. Bye.
Thank you.
That was